So some of you probably saw yesterday that Ukraine struck a Russian airfield, and in doing so, they destroyed at least one, possibly two Tupolev Tu-22M Russian long-range strategic bombers. This is one on fire currently in this picture. This bomber, and this is what it looks like when it's not on fire. Here's another picture of the fire if you want to see a different angle. But this is what this bomber looks like when it's not on fire. It's kind of a janky bomber. In fact, for the longest time, it had structural problems to where they would break apart when they landed. And they've had to go through a series of upgrades to make sure that that doesn't happen. An aircraft needs to land. And this aircraft has a kind of a checkered past within the Russian Soviet space. So they weren't used very often, but they are finding work against Ukraine because their speed, because they're a faster bomber, gives them the ability to move rapidly, deploy ordnance, and then move rapidly off the battlefield faster than traditional bombers would, which is giving Russia an edge in deploying this ordnance. It's very similar, not in design, but similar in how it's used to the US B-1 Lancer, which is a supersonic bomber platform that the US has used for a few decades now. Ours looks way better, but that's usually par for the course for aircraft when it comes to Russia. Now, one thing I want to talk about here that's kind of interesting is when you look at where these were based and where these were hit, they were hit up in Novgorod, right up here. This is where those are based. That's not near our Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainians launched and flew this drone nearly 700 kilometers. The interesting thing is the majority of us in the Western planning world continue to, even to this day, assume that this kind of swath of territory here, that includes Belarus, is some of the most, and then obviously integrated into Moscow and St. Petersburg, is some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. This is an airspace that we had presumed nothing could really get through unless it was of stealth capability, advanced design, fifth generation Western aircraft. And the Ukrainians seemingly flew a drone, and it wasn't a stealth drone, seemingly flew a drone from their somewhere in their territory to this airfield and struck these Tupolev bomber aircraft. That's interesting that they were able to do that the Ukrainians were able to somewhat apparently get through 600 to 700 kilometers of what should be considered the most heavily defended airspace in Russian territory, this area right here, because this airspace is the airspace that detects anything coming from the west towards Moscow, anything coming from the west towards base systems and structures here, as well as is integrated in defending parts of the St. Petersburg region. But as I said, Ukraine seems to have flown some drones, and again, these weren't like advanced stealth drones, and struck an airfield in Russia. What does that say about their air defenses in this region, and what does it say about our assumptions of what their air defenses are capable of in this region when we think of our ability to conduct our own sorties in some potential warfare scenario with Russia? Not saying it's going to happen, but it's kind of got me scratching my head a bit as to how this drone went through hundreds of kilometers of what should have been the most heavily defended airspace in the world and struck a Russian target well outside of Ukrainian borders.